SSSS.Gridman is not anything new. It is not an innovator, nor is it a flawless masterpiece. In fact, in a lot of ways, it is a by-the-books stereotypical anime that people like to make fun of. You know, it's got the main protagonist with the clearly noticeable hair who runs into a sensei figure and learns that the power of friendship is greater than any evil force in this world. And look out, here comes a stupidly energetic and annoying sidekick who always tries his best but comes up short, and even a vanilla fanservice cute anime girl. 2 of them. But despite this, Gridman is one of the best anime that I have ever seen. While I have heard of the names, I am very unfamiliar with any of the original Ultraman or Gridman shows. In fact, I am a complete stranger to the tokusatsu genre as a whole, the genre that the 2018 Gridman bases itself off of. The most exposure I've had would be the occasional Power Rangers I saw as a kid and don't remember much of. By all means, Gridman should have failed to resonate with me, but it didn't. Gridman is supremely cheesy. I was laughing my ass off at some parts because I couldn't believe what I was witnessing, and I loved every moment of it. It was some of the most fun I've ever had. But it also takes a turn into a brilliantly written, dark story that delves into character psyches and asks questions about existence. Gridman successfully appealed to both sides of the anime fan in me. It delivered all of the fun I wanted to have while watching an anime, but it also delivered the compelling story that I wanted to experience while watching an anime. And it does both on a very high and very consistent level. Before we get into the thick of things, I want to go over my experience of watching Gridman. I watched it over the course of 3 days. Episodes 1 and 2 on the first day, 3, 4, and 5 on the second, and on the third I binged the remaining 7. The effect this had was that by stopping where I did on the second day, I unintentionally would be starting the third day on the episode where Gridman would be taking a turn into its darker and more complex story. This meant that on the last day, I experienced all of the twists, the ups and downs in a single sitting. I am willing to admit that binging these episodes on the last day probably got me more emotionally invested in the anime than I would have been if I spread it out a little more. So why does this all matter anyways? It's because that third day had a lot of influence over how I ended up viewing certain story elements and moments. For anyone that hasn't seen Gridman yet, that's my quick, relatively spoiler-free review of it. I cannot recommend it enough, and for anyone that planned on watching this video without watching Gridman, I strongly urge that you reconsider. While I technically won't be spoiling everything in it, I will be spoiling all of what I consider to be the best part when I do a full breakdown of it later on. About a third of the video will be dedicated to it. It's a truly amazing experience, especially if you binge all or the last 7 episodes in a single sitting like I did. And with the spoiler warning now out of the way, let us begin. I want to start with episode 1 because I have a bit of a story with that episode. Despite how much I love the anime, I was actually not impressed by it at the start. In fact, it almost took me until the end of the first episode before I bought my first class ticket onto the hype train. So I want to review what caused me to feel unimpressed and what it was the anime did to win me over. I will be skipping the first minute of episode 1 because I'll be going back to that in a bit. After the first minute, we are greeted with Yuta waking up. He's an amnesiac. A little later, he hears Gridman calling him from junk, but Rika cannot see Gridman. I immediately had a problem with this. Amnesia, if used incorrectly, can hurt a story a lot. First of all, amnesia gives your characters sort of a 0 point to start at, a blank canvas for the writers to fill out as the story goes. However, this can lead to having the character's identity being defined too late and spending too much time in building out said character. Amnesia can also be used as a crutch to explain when the story brings in new parts by saying this existed the whole time but you just don't remember it. This can be fine, but it has to be used in extreme moderation. I can remember there only being one case of this, but thankfully it's pulled off well. I don't think Yuta's amnesia is something that neither helps nor harms the story. I'll go into more detail about this later, but for now I just want to say that after the first 2 or 3 episodes, his amnesia does not become important for the remainder of the story until the end. For a bigger problem, we have Gridman. The first episode does this a lot, dropping in a lot of short bits that try to add mystery and tension. I despise it when stories pull the special thing only one person can see gimmick because it's this artificial way of creating mystery or tension without having to invest in building up the atmosphere or situation. This can work sometimes, but it absolutely doesn't here since Gridman on the screen is such a small thing. I'll admit that Rika giving Yuta shit for it a little later was pretty funny, but again, I don't like it as a whole. This gets worse when in the next episode, Rika can start seeing Gridman, so what was the point of having that when it was going to go away so soon? It's funny too because the anime does this better just mere moments later with the big background kaijus. These work because their scale is massive and they're a lot more visually impressive, so when Rika can't see them, it's a bigger surprise than a guy on a screen. When she and Utsumi can start seeing them, they're still very imposing and the mystery surrounding them is kept hidden for long enough that I am happy with them. For another good example, let's look at when Rika is giving Yuta some sass for his amnesia and the Gridman thing. Their conversation has these constant little jumps in them to a point where I had to refresh the page because I thought my laptop was bugging out. This is a nice way of adding a little mystery in the air since it causes the conversation to feel very unnatural. It's not indicative of something wrong with the situation yet, but is better than the Gridman shtick from earlier. Similarly good moments of this in the first episode include Caliber randomly appearing and the kaiju carving. When the actual kaiju first appeared, I was underwhelmed. I couldn't get over how goofy it looked and how clunky it moved. It destroying the school also did very little in my opinion, because even though the girl from earlier dies, she was merely a passing character and not much else, at least in the context of episode 1. And while Gridman looked a lot cooler, he also had really clunky movement, and watching the two fight looked like it was all happening in slow motion. Another pill that the first episode presents that I had a hard time swallowing was how fast Rika and Utsumi jump on board to help Gridman. Utsumi I can kind of understand, but with how much of a skeptic Rika was for most of the episode, she got onto that computer real fucking quick. Where episode 1 started to turn for me was when the opening music kicked in because it felt like something that was missing from the fight finally found its way into it. While the music helped, the single moment that caused a 180 in my perspective was this. The laser beam was complete overkill. It was so unnecessary for the fight and I loved every single second of it. A realization clicked into my head as I was watching the laser cannon charge up and fire. SSSS.Gridman was the anime I dreamed of watching when I was a kid. Once this wave of nostalgia overcame me, I stopped minding all of the awkwardness in the movement and the hilariously fake looking kaijus. I now see this weird charm to their appearances and movements that I can't quite describe. The action can get really cheesy and it's an absolute blast to watch. The special attacks and transformation sequences are wonderfully animated with appropriately cheesy titles applied to them all. One of the characters that transforms is called Samurai Caliber because of course he fucking is called Samurai Caliber. My favorite part of every fight was at the start of them when Yuta crossed his arms because it reminded me so much of the cartoons of my childhood. The very ending of episode 1 contains a problem, however. The day resets back to normal after the kaiju's defeat. In the next episode, it's revealed that nobody remembers what happened the day before except for the trio, which is far too convenient in my opinion. I would have been fine with Yuta's memory being intact since he's directly linked to Gridman, however it's never explained why Utsumi and Rika's memories are intact. If their memories were intact in every reset after episode 2, that would make a bit more sense since Junk is upgraded to be more Utsumi and Rika friendly. It's one of those things that's just never explained because it was necessary for the plot to continue. However, aside from this issue, the reset mechanic as a whole works really well and is the best way the anime adds the mystery I talked about earlier. While I want to make a point about the first episode, let's get back to the one part we skipped. The first minute didn't make any sense to me on my first time watching, but it was subtly amazing when it was revealed in episode 10. This becomes such an eerie way to open the anime. I had actually forgotten about the first minute until I started rewatching for the sake of this video and discovering it again sent shivers through me. So that's pretty much all of episode 1. People might disagree with what I'm about to say here and I could fully understand it if they did. From here, throughout the remainder of the anime, I believe that the quality of Gridman's writing is consistently outstanding. I didn't find any of the episodes to feel slow in pacing or turn into a pointless filler subplot. Even the fan service episode had story moments to rely on, with Akane confirming Yuta as Gridman, as well as showing the mountains disintegrating. I think the main examples used to argue against my point about Gridman's consistency would be some of the earlier episodes. I do think that a lot of the episodes in the first half don't have much in terms of pushing the overall story forward. However, I found the subplots in them to be interesting enough that when coupled with the action sequences, I never experienced any issues with boredom. Aside from consistency, another aspect of the story that is just as good is its reveal of big story components. but it's not so much about what the story reveals, but instead how it is revealed. There's two I want to talk about. One of these reveals is Akane being the main villain. This is revealed in episode 2 extremely early on into the anime. The timing of when you reveal your villain is very important, and the early reveal in Gridman is nothing short of great. Revealing your main villain very early can be problematic in the sense that viewers are going into the bulk of the story while already knowing what the final encounter will be or should be. This can cause events between the early reveal and the final encounter to feel tedious and sometimes unnecessary. Gridman avoids falling into this trap by having Akane be a very involved character in the story. She's creating new kaijus, trying to get information out of other characters, and even has visible emotional ups and downs. We're getting to see the story from the villain's side. If Akane was revealed as the villain much later on, these early scenes would lose all their impact. The anime would no longer have a justifiable reason to show us the kaiju creations or her ups and downs without spoiling her identity, which would make Akane a much more boring character and lead to an underwhelming reveal as well. Another reason why her early reveal works is because her motivation is also revealed just as early. This dramatically increases the tension in any scene involving Akane because we never know what little thing is going to set her off next and cause her to create another kaiju. The second big reveal happens halfway through Gridman in episode 6. This is where the little kaiju girl comes up to Yuta and takes him on a train ride while giving him a nice soul exposition dump. I won't spoil the exposition presented here yet because I want to do a bigger exploration of it later on. There are two massive problems that could have come up from this, but Gridman manages to successfully avoid both in my opinion. The first potential problem is that exposition dumps are very boring. They put a screeching halt to the progress of the story, and during these nothing else is likely to happen until the character shuts their mouth. The second potential problem is that the little kaiju girl is a completely new character. If it was somebody like Gridman or one of the Neon Genesis members, then it would make more sense because those are characters we've seen for multiple episodes and have been actively involved. However, the anime instead decides to use its one opportunity to pull the something that existed but you don't remember card out with Yuta's amnesia. The little kaiju girl appears, dumps all of that juicy exposition, then never shows up again until the very last episode. So you can see how this all could have rolled up into a giant problematic snowball, and that begs the question as to how Gridman avoids it. The actual information given out during the little girl's exposition dump is unbelievable. It's hard to take in, and it drastically changes the anime's perspective on a certain something. Then we have to look at where this information comes from. The little girl is a brilliant way to introduce all of this exposition into the story. Because she disappears at the end of episode 6, the characters have no means of asking her again for additional information or clarification. What we are given is all we're going to get. The little girl is also a kaiju. The only kaijus we've seen up to this point are all Akane's creations. Since another with a human form was introduced in the form of Auntie, who's to say that with all of the information from the episodes leading up to 6, that this little girl isn't just another one of Akane's creations designed to mess with everyone. Add on top of that the completely nonsensical music and animation used during this reveal. This is followed up in the very next episode with Rika and Utsumi calling bullshit on his story and not believing Yuta. When characters have seen a lot of crazy things but refuse to believe what the protagonist says is another trope that I hate, but once again Gridman avoids this from being a problem because even I was having a hard time believing it all. There's so many things that go into this reveal that adds complexity and causes itself to linger in the back of the viewer's mind as the anime progresses. That's why I think it's so good. This is probably the scene that was influenced most by how I watched the anime, which adds another reason as to why I feel so strongly about binging those last episodes. That being said, I think that the way episode 6 presents itself is the anime's main flaw. This doesn't have to do with the actual content of episode 6 since I just talked about how much I love the way Gridman did it. Instead, it has to do with what comes before and after this episode. The first and second half are quite different in terms of tone and focus. The first half is very action heavy. While this doesn't go away after episode 6, the anime becomes less about the action and turns into a very character-oriented story. A greater emphasis is put on dialogue and conversations, and in my opinion, the second half is all the better for it. I do genuinely believe that if Gridman remained action-centric for its entire duration, I would not have enjoyed it anywhere near as much as I do now. However, I can easily see people saying that they would enjoy the anime just as much, if not more, had it prioritized action from start to finish. The second half of Gridman contains a top-notch quality of writing for a handful of characters, Some of these characters by themselves elevated my experience with the anime far greater than any of the fights ever did. But the reason I believe that this transition fails is because the anime doesn't do a good job in setting it up. People could start watching Gridman but not really care for the action and drop it early, meaning they wouldn't be able to watch the second half to potentially change their opinion on it. Conversely, I think people could absolutely love the action-driven first half and then get turned off by the second half when the action is no longer its main focus. I think one way to create a smoother transition would have been to have the little kaiju girl appear very briefly across a couple of the previous episodes as an observing character and utter 1 or 2 lines pertaining to the information she eventually reveals. Not only would this add more mystery to the story in these episodes, but it would also give little tidbits of information that would sit in viewers' minds without taking up the foreground, information that can later be recalled in episode 6. Despite how highly I regard the last 7 episodes of Gridman, it still has some minor issues. I'm sure many of you guys will consider these to be nitpicks because really that's what they are. The trio's excuses for realizing the truth in episode 9 are not that great aside from maybe Yuta's. The anime makes a big deal about revealing the inside of Akane's house in episode 10, but it doesn't become relevant again for the main story. Speaking of episode 10, is Akane's house actually right next to the junk shop? The transition was almost certainly there just for transition's sake, but it still bothers me, especially since Akane says in episode 9 that her house is right next to Rika's. If the villain was right next door the whole time, why don't they ever go there to confront her? Caliber fighting Auntie feels like a very forced moment to progress Auntie's character. It kind of comes into play again later, but I'd argue that this could have been rewritten a bit and put into one of his later conversations with Akane instead. Lastly, I don't like Alexis Karib as the final fight. This is something I'll talk about more later, but I wanted to mention it now while I was here. Gridman's story, paired with its beautifully animated fight scenes, lays out an extremely solid groundwork for the characters to be propped up on. The anime initially got me hooked with its cheesy action sequences, but I'm sure you can tell by how much I love the latter half that my interest in Gridman shifted away from this end towards the characters. Those characters are my absolute favorite part of Gridman. It got to a point where I started feeling small amounts of disappointment whenever conversations and moments between characters were set aside for action to happen. And I think with that said, we're ready to start exploring these characters. I think that Gridman has a really good cast of characters, which I know is a rather generic statement, so I'll explain. To do this, I want to start by looking at who I believe to be the weakest character in the entire anime. Yuta suffers from being a bland protagonist. You know, he cares about his friends, he wants to stop the kaijus, and oh my, isn't it cute that he has a crush on Rika. While these parts of his characters are fine, the last one on Rika even gets played for some comedy points now and then, that's all that comes to mind for me whenever I think about Yuta. This all sounds pretty negative for him, but in the end it's actually beneficial for the anime. Yuta's main job is to go out there and fight, and that's all he needs to do. These aren't just one and done fights, another tally mark in the win column. These fights aren't about Yuta learning a lesson after each one and experiencing the so-called character growth. There are physical, lasting consequences that happen as a result of these fights. Lives aren't just being lost, the timeline is actively being rewritten by these resets. This is what makes Gridman fantastic. These consequences are what drives character development forward. Characters respond differently to the lives lost and altered timeline, and that is what I think makes Gridman's characters so good. Getting back to Yuta, let's talk about his amnesia. In the first section, I already talked about how I feel about opening stories with an amnesia protagonist. Now let's talk about how the anime closes out this amnesia and its explanation for it. The reveal that Gridman was Yuta the entire time is not good. It's not good. I didn't like this reveal at all because it felt like an extremely ham-fisted way of trying to explain away the amnesia. Yes, this is hinted at before the actual reveal, and I'm aware of the fact that Yuta and Gridman unlocking this truth helps them evolve into the Super Gridman, a sort of Neo Gridman, if you will. But even the reveal of the Neo Gridman just wasn't enough for me to really be impressed or blown away by the Gridman is Yuta explanation. To be perfectly honest, I don't think Yuta's amnesia needed to be explained at all. With how the story changes in the second half of Gridman, the cause of Yuta's amnesia went to the bottom of my list of things I wanted to know. Furthermore, there was already a better possible explanation earlier on. Akane through Alexis has the ability to create whatever she wants. She says this to Rika a few times. So all that needed to be said was Yuta was created by her with no memories. Given that he becomes her boyfriend during the ethereal kaiju's dream attack, the amnesia could have been used as an excuse to further ensure that Yuta doesn't have any pre-existing feelings for anyone to guarantee this fantasy comes true. However, with how consistently good Gridman's writing is, I think hiccups like these are forgivable. Since we finished up on Yuta, I think it's fair to quickly go over Gridman as well, the actual robot, alien, computer, whatever he's supposed to be. His personality is not that important in the grand scheme of things, and while characters whose only defining trait is, "we must defeat the bad guys," like Gridman usually piss me off, this didn't bother me at all, because once again, it gave me vibes from those cartoons of my childhood, which only added to the nostalgic feeling the anime does so damn well. Utsumi is next, and I could see this character being one that people don't really care for. He's sort of the sidekickiest of sidekicks. He doesn't have any major influence over the story, nor does he get any real serious screen time. However, I think Utsumi is actually fascinating, at least thanks to how the anime wraps up his character. At the start, he's way more excited about Gridman than anyone else and is completely nerding out. He's the one who coins the name Gridman Alliance. He tries to predict what the kaiju will do based on what he's read and seen from the Ultra series, which Bohr makes fun of him for later. He refuses to tell Akane the truth later because, being the honorable knight that he is, Utsumi doesn't want her to get involved. And this is all understandable since Utsumi loves this kind of stuff. Experiencing Gridman fight right before his eyes is like living out a dream for him, like he's in his beloved Ultra series himself. But episode 11 revealed the fact that Utsumi feels remorse for how much he indulged in watching Gridman fight without taking the consequences seriously. He comes to the realization that despite how invested he was in watching the fights, he actually contributed very little to their success. This is a direction I was shocked to see Utsumi be taken in. It puts him in a different light when you go back and watch some of the earlier episodes in the anime. Watching him root for Gridman again in those episodes made me feel uncomfortable to watch because I knew that he would go on to regret it all later on. And while he does cheer up by the very end, the way the last two episodes place this additional layer onto his character completely saves him from being what would have been an otherwise really forgettable character. The Neon Genesis gang, Max, Fitch, Bohr, and Samurai Caliber are all welcome additions to the cast in an unobtrusive way. The anime never goes out of its way to draw much attention to them, maybe except for Caliber, and that's the right thing to do. The Neon Genesis kids are really no more than Gridman's pit crew, and the anime is aware of that. With that said, little tidbits are incorporated into their interactions and add color to their individual personalities. Bohr reading a manga while they're spying on Rika and Akane, Vit not paying attention when it was his turn to fuse with Gridman, Max casually doing the dishes in the background. My favorite is when Utsumi asks them who is the strongest and no one replies immediately, giving me the feeling that nobody wanted to admit somebody else was stronger than them. The anime spends very little time in putting these details in, yet these details are more than effective enough at helping spice up these characters in ways that don't interrupt with the flow or pacing. Rika's friends Hasan Namiko and her mother get significantly less screen time than the Neon Genesis gang, but the little we do see out of them is similar to Neon Genesis in that it paints them in a more interesting light, even though these three are rather unimportant characters. Alexis Carib is a mysterious character done almost perfectly. There's so many things to like about this character. His personality is so overly casual that it's almost uncomfortable, especially for being this all-powerful alien entity that looms over Akane's shoulders the entire time. His motivations are also shrouded for most of the anime, and that's the part I like the most about Alexis. My favorite kind of mysterious characters are ones where I know how they're going to speak and act, but not why they speak and act in that way. If we don't know why they do it, then we start trying to piece together the motivation on our own to guess what makes this character tick. That's what I was doing with Alexis for a lot of the time, and was almost certainly convinced that he helped create the kaijus and watch the world fall apart because he merely enjoyed it. I was kind of correct, but ended up being disappointed when he revealed his real motivation, that his immortality made him feel hollow, so he goes around taking over people with terrible emotions like Akane to feel satisfied. While this is a great motivation in a standalone sense, the anime does very little to hint at either his immortality or hollowness, so this comes out as a big newsflash during the final fight. Next on the list is Anti, and with this I want to talk about recurring minor antagonists. Whenever a minor character is recurring, they have to have a good reason to keep coming back and insert themselves into the story, otherwise it's easy for them to fall into the trap of becoming filler. Anti not only fulfills this purpose, but becomes a B-plot to follow alongside the main storyline. There are two relationships of Anti that are realized amazingly well and combined together almost seamlessly. The first is with Gridman. Anti's powers contribute a lot to this, his ability to adapt and copy whatever new tricks Gridman has up his sleeve. This, with the fact that he was created for the sole purpose of defeating Gridman, means that he's almost supposed to be this final boss in terms of just power descriptions. So this starts to put a weird light on him when he keeps losing over and over after his first win. Half of his losses aren't even proper losses, he just runs out of energy and has to shrink back to human form. The second relationship of Auntie is with Akane, of course. She treats Auntie like every other kaiju she has ever created. If it doesn't succeed, then it's useless and she immediately abandons it. This works perfectly fine with every other kaiju, but it doesn't with Auntie, and this is where his dynamic with Gridman starts to come into play. Gridman and Yuta refuse to kill Auntie because he's human half the time, so he always goes back to Akane whenever he fails so she can deploy him again. But immediately after his first defeat, she deems him a failed creation and is abandoned. You start feeling pretty bad for the guy, honestly. Auntie's entire existence revolves around two figures, but both of them essentially are working against him. I think his ties to Akane are especially sad to watch since after being abandoned and abused, he keeps coming back to help her whenever she's in danger, all while Akane's stance on him never changes. Auntie eventually copying Gridman so much that he becomes Grid Knight is part of the anime that is filled with brilliant irony. Auntie's entire purpose is to defeat Gridman, so he has to transform into Grid Knight to ensure that Gridman isn't defeated by the kaiju. Being Grid Knight is also the only way he becomes strong enough to try and save Akane later as well. Auntie is a great example of another thing that the anime does well, closing out some of its characters. By some characters I mean specifically 4, but this doesn't mean that the closure provided for the other characters in the anime are poor. They're fine, but compared to the big 4, their closures feel pretty meh. The 4 are Utsumi and Auntie, who we've already talked about, and 2 characters I've tried to mention relatively sparsely in this section, those being Takarada Rika and Shinjo Akane. Compared to everyone else, their character arcs have much more substance to them. The entire video has been kinda sorta building up to this point, and I've got a disproportionate amount to talk about, especially for one of them. The anime switches to their perspectives more frequently as it enters its second half, where Rika and Akane shine as the best characters. Akane starts off by being this cartoonishly evil villain. She creates a kaiju every time somebody slightly pisses her off and revels in watching it terrorize the city as the kaiju hunts for its victim. Her room looks very childish, there's piles of garbage everywhere and figures displayed to the ceiling. Alexis acts like her babysitter. I think it also extends out to how her kaijus look and how she seems to design a lot of them by making them look cool instead of being practical. She even has a bit of an anger issue with the way she constantly hits Auntie and kicks Alexis. As revealed in episode 6 by the little girl, Akane is the god and creator of the world we see. This obviously has massive implications on how we view the anime. As episodes go on, we realize the story is no longer about a villain causing chaos in the city just for the sake of it, and Gridman has to go save the day again. Gridman is an invader into Akane's creation, an X-factor she never knew could be possible. The city is supposed to be this perfect haven for Akane, and Gridman is actively trying to stop the city from becoming such. From this perspective, Gridman is the villain. The anime does take until episode 9 to fully reveal that side of her story to the viewer, but you can see how much it changes once we learn about it. So that's the perspective we have to see everything through, and with that in mind, let's get going. Episode 2, Akane is revealed as the main villain, and like I said, she's cartoonishly evil. She's killing everyone she doesn't like because it's part of the process in creating her perfect world. People might and will say that the reasons Akane uses to justify her actions at this point are childish and have little thought put into them, but that's the point. There are no consequences for her actions yet. She is the judge, jury, and executioner of her own world. And while one of the things we don't know about Akane's world is how old it was before Gridman entered the picture, I'm inclined to say that it was still very new. I say that because in a fresh new world, Akane would be very excited to start wiping out any little imperfections every time she sees them. With that said, here comes Gridman. At first, she treats him like everything else, another imperfection. She creates Auntie to get rid of Gridman, and it works the first time. Then both Auntie and her other kaijus fail, then fail, and fail again. Her creation's repeated failures are what prompts the first change in her character. Episode 5 is where all of this change begins. She can no longer only rely on her kaijus, so it's her turn to enter the battlefield. She confirms Yuta is Gridman in episode 5 and sends Auntie to kill Yuta directly in episode 6. The big mountain kaiju isn't about trying to kill anyone, it's purely about drawing out Gridman. But that's enough about everything that happens before episode 6. I can only go on for so long without talking about what happens to Akane after the big reveal. The second half of the anime carefully details out Akane's descent one step at a time. My goal with this section of the video is to go through each and every one of these steps and outline how each one adds so much to her character and makes her one of the best humanized villains I've ever seen. Let's begin with episode 7. Akane breaks into Yuta's apartment and gives him an offer to join her side as another god of the world, and Yuta politely declines because the power of friendship is one hell of a drug. So we have to look at why Akane is there to begin with. The easy answer is, of course, so that she can make the offer to Yuta, but then we have to ask why again. My answer for this is that she has begun giving up on beating Gridman. She doesn't look or act like she has given up yet, but that's the best part since I think she still has subconsciously. This is better seen in episode 8, but 7 sort of builds that foundation. Akane is attempting to bargain with Yuta and by extension Gridman in this episode. If they are on her side, she no longer has anyone to oppose her and can go back to stomping out the imperfections in her world. This is the first time in the entire anime where she tries to compromise with Gridman instead of combating him. She's not trying to kill or extort information out of anyone since both tactics have failed in eradicating Gridman. Earlier I joked about the power of friendship, but that is something unironically very serious to Akane. She is lonely. That's one of the main things the little girl brought up in the previous episode. She asks Yuta whether or not she is his friend, and Yuta is unable to answer, but his indecision is the loudest answer to Akane. She couldn't get Yuta to confidently say she was his friend even after his big quip about how he can't betray his friends. She couldn't win him over by bringing him up to god status either, and that's really saying something given that she created the whole world. Akane couldn't beat Gridman and she couldn't win him over either, but while Gridman is still here, her perfect world will cease to exist. Now Akane's goal has become to prove that she can beat Gridman and that she is stronger. The person she ends up trying to prove this to out of everyone is herself. She takes Yuta to the restaurant owned by the family of her first victim. She so casually explains why she killed the girl. She calls in Alexis to have Yuta physically see him. Akane is surrounded by reminders of her successes. Yuta is supposed to be intimidated by this, but he's more concerned with what their actual motive is. Instead, the restaurant scene ends up turning into a sort of grotesque victory parade for Akane. It's like she's telling herself, yes, I have altered the timeline before. Yes, I have a powerful alien being at my beck and call. Yes, I am a god of this world. These are all true statements and everyone recognizes them, but what's the point of it all when she is still lonely in the end? The only entity in this world she can turn to reliably is Alexis Karib. One could argue that there's also Auntie, but with how Akane treats Auntie, I don't think it's a fair comparison to Alexis. So that's the bulk of episode 7. Again, episode 8 does a better job in expanding upon the idea that Akane has given up, and while we'll get to that shortly, there's one last thing about 7. One of the things that Alexis says to Akane after Auntie's kaiju appears is that the stronger the hate, the stronger the kaiju becomes. Try and keep that line in the back of your head. Moving on to episode 8, we get to start with Akane carving out a new kaiju specifically made to beat Gridman. At school, she calls Yuta, Rika, and Utsumi over and excitedly reveals her newest and strongest creation. She warns the trio that she'll be unleashing it at the school festival in a few days. A little while later, Yuta and Utsumi confront her to try to convince her to target somewhere else, but Akane refuses, with her reason being that she hates the festival. The first thing to pick apart here is her attitude. She's clearly very excited to show off her new kaiju as well as to attack the festival, and I attribute it all to her newfound purpose in thinking she can defeat Gridman. While it has been the case for a few episodes by the time we get to 8, Akane has stopped caring about her perfect world until Gridman is gone. So if she can't beat him, she no longer has a purpose. Akane reveals her kaiju and plans to the trio early because she's confident in being able to win. It's like she's trying to rewrite the first fight she ever had against Gridman. She retrofits the first kaiju he ever fought, and she's targeting where a lot of people will be so she can cause the same amount of destruction she used to be able to. Speaking of the festival, let's look at her stated reasoning for attacking it, that she hates the festival. This is such a pathetic, half-assed excuse, even when you compare it to some of her earlier motives for kaijuing up. Yuta's lunch got ruined, the teacher bumped into her and didn't apologize, and those guys were cutting her off from talking to Rika. These are all terrible excuses to try and kill someone, but at least we can kinda say that we see where she's coming from. She doesn't have a good reason for attacking the festival, but she still needs to lure out Gridman, hence the poor excuse. The night before the festival, when Akane is talking to Alexis, something's not quite right. She doesn't have the same confidence or excitement she had when she was talking to the trio earlier. Instead, she seems anxious, and for obvious reasons. If she loses again, then how is she ever supposed to beat Gridman or recover her perfect world? The anxiety seems to persist into the next day where, of course, her new kaiju is no match for full power Gridman, who just decimates it. The day resets back to normal and the festival goes all according to plan. After the credits roll, Akane is seen laying on the floor while Alexis is telling her that she can do better. This defeat is very different compared to the earlier ones we've seen. Previously, Akane was either riled up or amazed at what Gridman can do, both of which naturally led her to build better kaijus. And now she's dejected. The montage of clips from the festival are purely ironic because the successes of Gridman makes everyone happy. Every time he wins, everyone else takes another step into ruining her perfect world while Akane further loses control of it. This is also the first time in the entire anime where Alexis expresses disappointment towards Akane, who he had previously been smothering with praise. I love what Alexis says here because while all signs before this pointed towards Alexis being under Akane's control, this puts in that inkling of an idea that maybe it was the other way around all along. Lastly, about halfway through episode 8, Akane is talking to Rika. One of the things Akane says here is that she designed everyone in the city to love everything about her. Clearly this isn't true since Gridman has been polluting people's minds. So if Akane ever wants her perfect world where everyone loves her to return, there's only one way back. Episode 9 introduces a kaiju with a new purpose. It isn't meant to kill and destroy like all of the previous ones we've seen. Instead, its purpose is to dream. It creates 3 dream worlds in which Yuta, Utsumi, and Rika are captured within, where they relive the story of this world from the beginning. Except this time, Akane is actually loved by everyone as she intended her first world to be. But it doesn't last as the trio eventually realize they are dreaming, reject Akane's offer to stay, and awaken. Episode 9, despite one of the flaws I mentioned earlier on with the trio's excuses, has to be my favorite in the entire anime because of how it chooses to explore Akane's character. There's a lot to unpack, and we have to start with why these dreams were created to begin with. I think the creation of the ethereal dream kaiju and its dreams is acceptance on Akane's behalf that her current world will never become perfect because it's too corrupted by Gridman. Furthermore, I think she tries to rectify the mistakes she made in her first world in order to allow the dream worlds to be perfect from the start. Instead of merely constructing everyone to love her and wait for them, Akane approaches her creations instead. She replaces Rika with herself when Yuta wakes up in the junk store and promptly becomes his girlfriend. She's nerding out together with Utsumi over kaijus without trying to extort information out of him. She sets herself up to be discovered by Rika and to start a real friendship. If she can ensure that the sole purpose of these dreams is fulfilled, then there is no need for kaijus, no need for Gridman to ruin her world. I think Akane believes that kaijus were her greatest mistake. It's why she never creates another one while inside the dreams, because then she won't draw the ire of Gridman. We don't see the giant repair kaijus in the background because she has no plans of resetting anything. She's going to make these worlds perfect from the start. One of the aspects that I love about the dream world is how little detail is put into parts of it, like Rika's mom or the photo of Yuta's parents. Akane would have little to no idea who those people are in the first world, but those details aren't important to her. She only cares about what will make her happy in the dream, so those kinds of characters are thrown by the wayside, barely existing. But even in these dreams, Gridman still plagues her. Despite the forced perfection happening in these dream worlds, they are still rotten at their core. They're entirely held together by the ethereal kaiju. And once the kaiju is defeated in the dream, it's all over. So that brings up the question of if Akane found a way to create these dreams without the use of a kaiju, whether or not Gridman would have found his way in once more. These dreams are her last-ditch attempt at trying to defeat her loneliness, but even here she is still abandoned by her creations, faced with the truth that she can no longer manipulate other people in order to create her own happiness. She now has nothing left. One of the things brought up in episode 9 after everyone wakes up is that there is one person who is still dreaming, Akane. They must now go and wake her up out of this world. She is attempting to be forced out of her own world by the creations she constructed to love everything about her. I think that part of her story is the real tragedy, that she has no say in what her ending will be. When she falls off the crane, she manages to land upright despite barely having the energy to keep herself walking. It's like some power within her world is forcing her to stay alive for some other reason. Now, I'll fully admit that the part with her fall is a complete stretch and that I'm trying to pull meaning out of something that was probably meant for dramatic effect, but I think you can still see the point. I talked earlier about how Akane didn't have to face the consequences of her actions due to her being the world's creator. Well, that was all true until now. However, it's not any physical consequence, but rather an emotional one. Akane feels regret in her actions, it's why she's haunted by her victims at the start of episode 10. She only feels this because her world is falling apart. If her world was left alone by Gridman, it's extremely likely that she never experiences this regret since she never has to face her mistakes. She no longer wants to create kaijus either for obvious reasons. It's only because Alexis forces her into creating another one that she does, and Patrick the Kaiju clearly shows signs of a disinterested attempt, but we do have a lot more to talk about this guy later. Moving away from Akane, let's look at something that happens in episode 10 away from her. In class, one of the students talks about how Akane hasn't shown up to school for a week, and later, while talking to Utsumi, Yuta says that kaijus haven't been appearing for a while. This implies that Akane is no longer interested in interacting with her own world anymore, something that is made abundantly clear by the end of the episode. Moving on, her conversation with Auntie is particularly interesting. She tells him that he's no longer a kaiju, and when he asks why, she gives him a list of things that makes a kaiju. When we look at the things she lists off, we realize that Akane has become a greater monster than her own creations. They can't read people's feelings, which is something she failed to do the entire anime when trying to win over people like Yuta and Rika. They don't help anyone, and neither does Akane. Lastly, they ruin lives by existing, which is sadly very self-explanatory. Another interesting point is that Akane doesn't want Auntie looking at her. It's like she's silently admitting that she has become as much of a monster as any of her creations, and maybe even a sense of shame that Auntie, a kaiju, exhibits more humanly traits than she does. The hallmark of this episode is, of course, the fight scene with Gridman versus this fucking thing. This unironically terrifying, noodly armed karate kaiju is too strong for even full-powered Gridman to fight. In episode 8, Alexis said something along the lines of stronger the hate, stronger the kaiju. This kaiju is the best example of that statement by an enormous margin. However, I think hate alone might be too narrow since despair is also part of what powers this kaiju. It's hard to say if the second kaiju was intentionally created or not. Looking at how poorly made the first one was, I don't think Akane had any malicious intent, no hate or despair behind that kaiju, and that she was making it because she was told she had to. My best guess has to be that while working on the first kaiju, it absorbed some of the emotions from Akane and incubated the second one inside itself. According to Auntie, this kaiju is Shinzo Akane's heart, which I take to be as a manifestation of the aforementioned two emotions. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that anything it does is representative of Akane's desires, even though she isn't telling it what to do like she did with many of her previous creations. Its first priority is to destroy the background repair kaijus since Akane no longer intends on resetting the world. This was already evident by her leaving the first kaiju's corpse sitting around. She does display some doubt about this though. She never expected her world to get to this point, so she has no way of predicting what will come next as a result. Because the emotions that the second kaiju is compromised of are so intense towards Gridman, it also fights him with the same intensity. It almost kills him, and it would've if it weren't for Auntie flying in to save the day as Grid Knight. I already talked about Auntie and Grid Knight, but why is he able to defeat the kaiju when Gridman could not? Yes, part of it is to save Gridman for himself later, but the more important part is because of his relation to Akane. Auntie is the only person, maybe save for Alexis, in the entire world who understand how she feels. He has experienced the same hatred towards Gridman and has also experienced the same disappointment and despair in his repeated failures against him. Because he understands how Akane feels, he's able to subdue and defeat this manifestation of her emotions. Akane entering the junk shop to stab Yuta at the end is almost like petty revenge at this point. She tried to stop Gridman so many times in so many different ways that there are no more options remaining for her. There's no kaijus, no Gridman, just the box cutter she used to carve her creations, but her world is already destroyed. Trying to kill Yuta and Gridman now won't do anything to restore this world. And this doesn't even work since he's back up and running again by episode 11. At the very end of 11, Alexis turns Akane into a kaiju. Alexis has come to the same conclusions that Akane has about the monster that she has become. And instead of the despair and defeat that she feels, there's this smug quality to Alexis's voice in this scene as if he was proud of the monster he had been enabling. Anyways, that's not as important as the fact that Akane has failed to realize until now that Alexis was using her the entire time. I think that now is a good time to recap everything about Akane that we've covered before we move on. We have a lonely girl who is approached by an alien who creates a new world for her where she is God. She erases any imperfections from this world through violent means with no consequences, since there is nobody to punish her. In pursuit of the alien, Gridman invades her world through the vessel of Yuta. Gridman hunts for Alexis, who is exerting his powers through Akane's kaijus, causing Akane to be caught in the crossfire. After Gridman successfully resists several of her attempts to construct a perfect world, she tries to both convince and combat Gridman, with both methods failing. In a last-ditch attempt, Akane creates 3 dream worlds to try and rectify the mistakes she made in her first world, but she is still abandoned by her own creations. Having become a greater monster than her own creations, Akane begins to destroy her world once and for all, only to become the next kaiju. As I said earlier, Shinjo Akane is one of the best examples of a humanized villain I've ever seen, and while there is a relatively minor problem with how her character is wrapped up in episode 12, it's similar to how I feel about the whole of Gridman. I enjoyed the whole thing so much that an occasional small issue isn't enough to lessen my experience. We're almost to the final section of the video, but before we get there, there's one last character we need to quickly look at. I don't have anywhere near as much to talk about Rika as I did with Akane. Despite being a devout member of the Church of Takarada Rika, there are certain universal truths that even my faith will not allow me to deny, and one of these is that Akane is the best written character in Gridman. However, I still think it's important to talk about Rika for one main reason. As we talked about, Akane's world ultimately fails and begins to collapse. Amidst the failure, there is still one success. That is Rika. We talked about this a little bit with Auntie, but I think Rika is a stronger example of a dynamic that can form between a creation and her creator. Episode 8 is a good starting point for exploring this dynamic. When Rika is arguing with Utsumi, she mentions how fighting Akane's kaijus is just putting off dealing with the issue. She also seems to have become wary of the Gridman alliance, with her expressing distaste towards Utsumi's constant want to fight. When you combine the two things, she says, it basically boils down to Rika wanting to find a peaceful solution. I think there's 2 reasons as to why she becomes so adamant about it. The first is the obvious one, that Akane is her friend. The second one is the slightly more complex one. Over the course of the anime, Rika is the only person whose friends and family we actively see and interact with. This causes Rika to become the most grounded person in the universe in the sense that she has the most ties to it. Therefore, she has more of a reason to care about the casualties that could happen as a result of the fights. When you move ahead a little bit in the same episode, we get to when Akane reveals to Rika that she was created in order to be Akane's friend. This does explain why Rika consistently points out that Akane is her friend, despite there being very little interaction between the two before this, and that it's not because the anime needed them to be. Little details to tie up any kind of loose ends like this are something I appreciate in animes. Anyways, when this happens, it does pose the question of whether Rika is like this because she genuinely believes Akane to be her friend, or only because she was merely programmed as such. I think the argument could be made for the first, given that Rika is the only person in the entire world who actively calls Akane her friend, but then who's to say that, again, that's not a result of the programming. The Dreamworld sequence of episode 9 reveals that despite Rika being very aware of her existence as a creation, she cannot support Akane. This is something I really like about Rika's character, in that she's provided with a split conscience. In some sense, Rika is set up to be this counterpart to Akane. She has the most ties to the universe like we talked about, while Akane has nobody. Furthermore, Rika has nothing special going for her. Yuta is Gridman, Utsumi is a kaiju fanatic, the Neon Genesis crew, Akane is a creator god, and you get the point. Her rather uncharacteristic status puts her as far away as possible from Akane's status, not to mention the whole creation versus creator dynamic. Lastly, Rika is always looking after whoever Akane is neglecting. At first, this was everyone else, the everyday people falling victim to Akane's recklessness. Later on, however, this becomes Akane herself as both her world and mental state begin to collapse. In episode 11, Akane tries to reject Rika by saying none of what's happening concerns her, to which Rika responds angrily that it does, and Rika is right, of course. The world was made so that the creations within could love Akane, and she has sacrificed many to try and achieve this. So to now say that her creations don't matter is an entirely selfish perspective, and I love that Rika calls attention to this one last time to almost open Akane's eyes for once. The scene at the end of 11 is great because it's like a repeat of the bus scene in episode 8, except it's not Akane saying that Rika was meant to be her friend, it's Rika saying it. Akane talks about being killed again, and the conversation even ends abruptly at a question. Rika's words clearly had some effect on Akane near the end, and she almost responds to Rika's questions before Alexis interrupts the conversation to make one last kaiju. I want to quickly say something before we start talking about episode 12. I like the ending to this anime, I really do. It was satisfying and everything came to a nice close, and it even delivers a pretty solid emotional moment too. But even though I like the ending, that doesn't mean it's entirely free of flaws. I want to point them out to show that, despite how much I enjoyed the ending, the lead up to it could have been better to create a really good entire episode instead of just a really good ending. These flaws range between minor nitpicks to major pieces of the episode. Firstly, I don't understand why Gridman needs Utsumi and Rika to be there to get his final form. My guess is that it was to ensure that there would be people at Junk to type the special signature to save a soul without directly saying it out loud. It all feels too anime-y with having all your friends camped around one spot to watch the last fight. I wouldn't have any problems with having Utsumi and Rika watch and react to the fight from the hospital and rooftop respectively. I also don't see why they couldn't have written it so the Neon Genesis kids enter first, but Yuta needs the special signature to access Gridman, so he types it or says it before going in. Maybe it's some sort of reference to one of the earlier Ultraman or Gridman shows, in which case I guess it's fine. Moving on to both of the fights in the episode, I have to say that I wasn't the hugest fan of either of them. Kaiju Akane lasts for a disappointingly short amount of time. The kaiju itself looks amazing, and I love the way it howls like a twisted and tormented version of Akane's voice. However, for having left episode 11 on a cliffhanger, Kaiju Akane felt like she got the short end of the stick to make room for the Alexis fight. Part of me wishes that this was the final fight and that Gridman fought her instead of Alexis. It would have been this great fight where Gridman and the gang have to save Akane from the clutches of the evil alien man once and for all, and have her totally not get sucked up by Alexis immediately after. Speaking of the final fight, I wish Alexis didn't transform to fight Gridman. Because of how mellowed out he was for so much of the anime, watching him become evil immortal robot man with big red swords honestly was a bit of a letdown. However, I do acknowledge that if this fight was removed, then there wouldn't be a good way to close off Alexis's character. If Gridman just ran him down and caught him that way after Akane was defeated, it'd be awkward and unsatisfying. He couldn't get up and leave the world either since he was so involved in the story by this point. I also dislike him absorbing Akane to fully transform. She's already been through a lot, so she doesn't need to go through more. And sure, someone could say, but it's to represent that Akane never had control of her world and that she was Alexis's puppet the entire time. But I say enough is enough. It's like the anime is trying to make sure you really feel bad for Akane. A simple solution would have been to say that he's been leeching off her misery the entire time and now he's accrued enough emotions to finally transform. On a side note, I think the animation of him sucking up Akane is hilarious every single time I rewatch it. Gridman's fixer beam is something I also have a problem with, since Gridman suddenly realizes halfway through the fight that he has a different purpose, and apparently that was enough to unlock his final smash. With that said, I don't want to take anything away from the actual fight itself though. As a matter of fact, I like the design of Alexis's combat form, and in terms of spectacle, this one is my favorite in the entire anime. The music used here is also fantastic. Once again, I want to emphasize how much I like the ending, and while I don't like to think about it, something does need to be brought up. Technically speaking, Akane hasn't done anything to deserve her redemption. She feels regret over her past decisions, sure, but she didn't fix the world, expel Alexis, or bring back her victims. Given how much she screwed over the world, I feel like she needed a little more to be fully redeemed. This doesn't become as much of an issue when you look at Alexis as the main villain instead of Akane, which by the end he definitely was. While this next point isn't a flaw by any means, I do wonder how the ending would have been if they never showed the part with Akane waking up in the real world. It would have left me with the impression that Akane really is a god and not just a human. There is a theory surrounding the awakening ending regarding Akane and Rika, and one that has a lot of interesting ideas tied to it. I won't talk about it here, but it might make for a fun project someday in the future. Moving along, I don't see the point in the scene with Auntie and the little girl. I'm sure there's some sort of reference or symbolism that I'm too dense to understand here, especially with the giant kaiju chilling in the background. The one final flaw I want to point out is that despite the power of friendship being a core theme of the anime, I could easily see wearing thin on someone very quickly with this episode. It's a bit of a problem with the entire anime, as you may have noticed with how many times I've said the word friend over the course of the video. I only bring it up here because the final episode is where it rears its friendly head out a little too much. Since that was a lot of negatives, I want to end talking about episode 12 on a positive note. I think the decision to end Akane's story by having her wake up out of the dream world and into the real one was a bold move and a move that works beautifully well. While it leaves me a little sad on the inside, I love that Gridman chose to put a finite, closed ending to its story. A lot of anime at this point would have liked to keep things as open as possible after the resolution in order to leave room for future seasons. They would have also chosen to end it in a nice, fuzzy way to make the viewers feel good about themselves as they head out. If this happened in Gridman, it would have been something along the lines of Rika telling Akane to stay in the world, and they promise to rebuild the world so that it's perfect for everyone and not just Akane. I do think the reason why Gridman's ending works is because it not only closes out Rika and Akane's story so well, but also because it remains consistent with everything leading up to it. Despite all of the support for Akane that Rika had shown over the last 2 or 3 episodes, she still recognizes that Akane does not belong in this world. Akane also recognizes it as well, and for the first and last time, she listens to what her creation tells her is right and leaves. While all of the conflict comes to a close when Gridman triumphantly defeats Alexis, there were still lives lost that will never be restored and an entire world that was nearly destroyed. Instead of trying to mask it all up with a happy ending, Gridman ends on an appropriately melancholy note. For better or for worse, the dream world will no longer be the same without Akane. As this project comes to a close, Gridman has left me with a bittersweet feeling. On one hand, I'm very happy that I had the chance to watch it, as it gave me some of the most fun I've ever had watching an anime, with the second half that, to me, was just a little bit short of being perfect. On the other hand, as stupidly cheesy as this may sound, part of me wishes I could go back and experience watching Gridman for the first time again. It was so nice to see this anime succeed at things I've seen others stumble in. While there definitely are others that hit bigger peaks than Gridman in certain aspects, my great amount of unwavering enjoyment of it from start to finish leaves it as one of the most highly consistent experiences in anime I've ever had. And because of it, the vaguely labeled continuation to Gridman, SSSS.Gridman, is one of my most anticipated upcoming titles, even more so than Season 2s of some of my other favorite animes such as Zombieland Saga. At the time of this video, there is not a lot revealed about Dynazenon. Given that the same 2 studios who worked on Gridman are behind Dynazenon, I can't help but have really high expectations for it. I'll definitely be covering it once it finishes airing. But as it stands, Gridman's story is now over. Yuta, Rika, Akane, the Neon Genesis crew. All of their stories are hopefully completed, and my eyes are set on the future of SSSS.Gridman, an anime that I can now confidently call one of my new favorites. Here's to hoping that Dynazenon will be even better than Gridman, and here's to maybe, just maybe, Rika finding her way into the story somehow. Not that I'm biased or anything. So, I guess this is it's time for the outro now. Well, I just wanted to take a few minutes, I guess, maybe a few minutes to, talk a little more about this video as a whole, not necessarily about Gridman, but, I guess you could call it meta commentary about the video. And then once that's done, I just wanted to talk a little more about the future of this channel, as big and grand as it sounds, looking into the rest of 2020 as well as a tiny bit into my plans going into 2021. So this project, the Gridman video, turned out to be much longer than I expected it to be. I was kind of thinking it would be in the same boat as Humanity Has Declined. I just hop in, hop out, make like a 15 to maybe 20 minute long video, and then once that was done, I just have that on the back shelf ready to upload once the strikes wore off, and then during that time I just work on making the Golden Wind video. Obviously plans have changed, and I'm actually really glad that they changed. I had a lot of fun making this video. While waiting out the strikes, I did some thinking about the videos uploaded so far to this channel, mostly about the Zombieland Saga one. While I'm still proud of the video, looking back at it, it's pretty bad. It has a lot of flaws in it, in my opinion. So as I worked on the Gridman video, it kind of sort of ended up being I guess you could call it a spiritual successor to the Zombieland Saga video, in that I tried to improve or fix some of the issues that were present in the first one. And I don't think I don't think this Gridman video was perfect by any means, but it's a step in the right direction, in my opinion. I wouldn't be surprised if I missed anything important from the anime, just because I wasn't aware of what any of the older Gridman or Ultraman references or present throughout the show. And besides that, at the very end of the video, in the conclusion of it, I praised the anime for its consistency, which I still think it's true. I still think the anime was a pretty consistent experience for me. I think I might be a minority when it comes to that opinion, although I haven't checked too many other reviews at this point to see what the general consensus is like. The only other thing I guess I want to say, because if I talked more about it, then this outro would probably outpace the video, but I think I was too mean towards episode 12. I looked at it far too seriously without considering that the story is winding down to a conclusion, and having mellow scenes like the girl and auntie is perfectly fine. I really didn't have any issue with it the more I thought about it. And complaining about that one part at the start of 12 being too anime-y, while praising the anime for doing the traditional cheesy anime tropes so well early on, is pretty ironic. I think it only bothered me so much in episode 12, because all of the previous episodes leading up to it, I guess in the second half, took themselves so fucking seriously that it just cracked the layer of immersion for me when we got to that point. So that's all I'm gonna say about this video for now. There's I could say more, but yeah, like I said, I just anyways, so other plans I have for this channel. The next video for this channel is going to be on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Wind. That was supposed to be my big project of the year, but plans have changed. And I'm going to be doing my best to keep it shorter than this one. I want to keep it a lot shorter, similar to length to the One Punch Man and Kaguya-sama videos, but we'll see how that goes. My only reason for wanting to keep it short is because I want to get this one out sooner rather than later, as I guess apparent as that sounds. There was also the Promised Neverland video, which brought me to the situation with the strikes, unfortunately. But while I was initially planning on re-uploading that video once the strikes wore out, I decided that I would just sort of toss the video and do it again in 2021 once Season 2 has completed airing, and just make a bigger video as a whole at that point. There's definitely going to be videos for both Season 2 of Kaguya-sama and Zombieland Saga, although it's, again, similar to Promised Neverland, very unlikely that I cover both of them this year. I'll probably end up doing videos for both of them in 2021, just for reasons. The rest of 2020 will be focused on trying to make shorter videos more often, and by shorter videos I mean like similar to the Humanity Has Declined one, around 10 to 15 minutes, maybe Kaguya-sama length, the 25-ish minutes at most. I'm highly unlikely to do any Gridman-sized videos as a result, and I'm also unlikely to cover any 2020 animes aside from one that hasn't aired yet, because my current backlog consists mostly of animes from past years that I actually want to get to. So I think that's it. I think that's all I have to say. I guess I guess I can cross my fingers and hope this video successfully makes it onto the internet tomorrow morning. And that YouTube plays nice with its copyright machine this time. So that's it for me, and take it easy, and stay healthy.